Opening words from Eric Fromm. Love isn't something natural. Rather, it requires discipline, concentration, patience, faith, and the overcoming of narcissism. Love isn't a feeling, it is a practice. Love isn't a feeling, it is a practice. Perhaps it is both. Perhaps it is a feeling that is cultivated through practice, but there is no denying that we must practice love. And what better place to do it than at the center of love, which is where you are, here and now, at every moment. So we gather together to practice love consciously so that we can go back out into the world and be agents of love, so that we may sow the seeds of love in all that we do, in all that we say. Or at least that's what we aim for. It's an incredibly challenging practice, isn't it? Keep your heart open to love, not just when times are good and easy, but especially when they're challenging, especially when we get triggered or our old wounds are aggravated. This is the practice that we have come here to do together, and I am honored and privileged to be here with you. It's been way too long. I feel like I missed 2 gatherings. It's like a month I haven't seen you all, and I was feeling it. But thankfully, we had our potluck last week. I wish Tara was here so we could thank her for that wonderful time. And I also wanted to apologize for the mess that we left in her house. We went for the cold water plunge after, and everybody was just like, oh, let's go, let's go. And then I got home and I was like, oh man, wait a second. We just left Tara's house like an absolute disaster. So thank you, Tara, for your wonderful hospitality and for facilitating this gathering. So as I was saying, like-hearted individuals, we don't always agree on everything, but we're coming from the same heart space, which means that everything else is just going to come out in the wash. We don't have to worry too much about whether you're a spiritual being having a human experience or a human being having a spiritual experience, or maybe a bit of both. We don't have to agree on the details. We just have to be in the same place. And I believe that we do this. And when people come to us and their cups are empty, and we fill their cups. And when people come to us and their cups are overflowing, then they get to fill other people's cups. When people show up here and they're hurting and they're in a bad way, what I can tell you is that you folks show up. You hold space, you support, and that's exactly the purpose of this community. So give yourselves a round of applause, because I know for a fact that everyone here does this. I know for a fact that when people come and they're hurting, they are met with love and acceptance and support. So please, that's monumental. If you like this, nobody asks you to do it, you just do it, because that's the kind of people we are here. So today, what are we going to be talking? Sometimes you get stories, personal stories from the speaker. Sometimes you get information and education. Sometimes you get conversations about practices, because once again, we are here practicing love, and there are a lot of other practices that go along with it. So today we're going to be talking about yoga. Now, if you're anything like me, until very recently, I always thought that yoga is basically a physical practice that involves holding certain positions for agonizing moments. It starts to make you question your life decisions, especially yin yoga, which Candace loves and has introduced me to. It's like, hold this position for 3 minutes and see how your back feels after that. But I discovered in my spiritual explorations that yoga is actually far more than physical postures and poses. And it was in the book, the Bhagavad Gita, that I learned that there are actually many yogas, and that this physical discipline is just one type of yoga. So first, a little bit of linguistic lessons here. Yoga comes from the root word in Sanskrit, yuj, which means to unite, to connect, to yoke. And so, grandly speaking, yoga is a practice to unite mind, body, and spirit with perhaps something that is even higher than that, God, or whatever you want to call it. And so any practice that brings you into union, that aligns your different centers and aligns you with the center that is everywhere at once, that is considered yoga. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks about 4 pathways to this type of union and alignment. He talks about karma yoga, which is union through action in the world. He talks about, and I'm going to butcher this one, jnana, which is union through knowledge. By studying and sharpening the mind, you can bring yourself into union. There's Raja Yoga, which I know many in this room practice diligently, the yoga of meditation, attaining union through meditation. And last, but certainly not least, and of supreme importance to us here at the Center of Love, is Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, of love, union through love, through absorption in the guru, in the partner, in the friend, whatever that may be. So this is just a preview of things to come, because our speaker today, Fabrizio, is a yoga instructor, and he knows not just about the physical practice of yoga, but also about the philosophy and the lifestyle that goes with it. So a few words about our speaker. Fab is a seeker and creator of beauty in the world. He is a musician, as we all can attest, an instrument maker, a yoga teacher, a husband, and a father. In everything he does, he strives for genuine appreciation and authentic expression of life as a direct experience of creative energy that is both immanent and transcendent. And so without further ado, I welcome you to the pulpit, Fabrizio. Thank you.
So I have no idea how we're going to proceed over these next 30 minutes or so. But because I had a whole bunch of things, visuals for you to kind of explore, and won't be able to use them because that's okay. So we'll improvise. The first thing we're going to do, though, is we are going to quell our fears with a little bit of chocolate. So my Abba is going to go around, and I invite you to select and enjoy a piece of chocolate.
Ooh.
Don't be shy. This is part of the presentation. This is part of the talk. To enjoy a piece of chocolate, and then we're going to talk about it in just a few seconds here. All right. So I want you to take note of your experience of eating chocolate. What senses are you engaging? What is your experience of this chocolate? So just in that experience, you've all kind of touched upon many of the things that the yogis going back thousands of years started discovering about the nature of existence, the nature of our experience of being alive. And one of the things that is clearly obvious is that we have 5 senses. Right? So we mentioned smell, there's the taste, there's the texture of it, the feeling of it, right? Did anybody notice the giggles and the approval and the happiness going through the room when chocolate was presented? So that makes sense. And seeing, so you obviously saw the chocolate on board, and you saw the different flavors, and you were able to choose. And so that gave you an idea, and some people chose more than one, which is perfectly fine, no judgment, straight. Some people chose more than one, and some people chose the flavor that they connected to for whatever reason, right? So we do have a freedom of choice. Okay, so that's the first kind of nature of existence that we can all agree on, that we can all recognize, that we have these 5 senses, right? And that we have these principles of mind that are connected to our senses, right? So we have somebody said, reference some memories, thinking, it makes you think of something, right? It makes you feel comfortable. It makes you feel happy, excited. So these are emotions. So, and then we have, these, you may have not noticed, but there may be something in the background that was happening that, you identify as like, oh, I only like dark chocolate, or I only like milk chocolate, or, oh, I don't know about this eco stuff, it must be not very good for me because it's whatever, right? So there's that, and there's that sense of identity that we get from this dialogue that's constantly going on in our minds that reinforce our sense of self, whatever that sense of self may be, right? Or, when I was judging Dre for having more than one, right? So that's my sense of self. I'm better. My self-righteous indignation that I would never have more than my share. Right? That's part of me, right? And then there's what the yogis call the buddhi mind, or the discerning mind, right? The mind that can see through all these causes and conditions and can cut through to like exactly what's going on, and can see all the causes and conditions that had to happen in order for this chocolate to be presented to you and for it to be able to make its way into your mouth and for you to be able to eat it. Like, when you think about that, chocolate comes from cocoa. Where did those cocoa beans come from? Most of us have no idea. We can look at the package, we can get an idea sometimes. What else is in there? There's sugar. Right? Somebody had to go and pick that cocoa bean. Somebody had to process it. Somebody had to harvest the sugar. Somebody had to create a facility in which we started to make chocolate. Somebody had to come up with the idea that we're going to take this bean off of a tree and we're going to crush it and we're going to process it in such a way and then create a mold, and we're going to put it into this mold and we're going to melt it and bring it up to a certain temperature to make sure that it stays stable once it melts, and we're going to create a bar out of it, and then we're going to add flavors to it. And where did that mint come from? Where did those almonds come from? The list goes on and on and on. And then, how many of you thought, like, what did I have to do to get that chocolate? Right? So I had to, go up to Nanaimo yesterday, and I live in Ladysmith, so it's not that big a deal. But I went to Nanaimo and I was looking for something that I could easily cut up into different pieces and give people a freedom of choice and all those things that have to go into this whole thing, right? And choose the right board to present it on and all this stuff, and separate it out this morning so I didn't have to sit here and have people touching your piece of chocolate while they break off a piece and all that. All that stuff happened. Right? So all that stuff is happening all the time. The stuff that we are aware of and the stuff that we're unconscious of and the stuff that we just get into a habit of doing. And when a piece of chocolate is presented to us, we just say, hey, I want some, and I grab it and I stick it in my mouth. And then next thing you know, you've had that piece of chocolate, but did you actually taste it? Right? Did you actually sit down and think, okay, so what actually is happening here? What actually is happening when this chocolate is meeting my tongue? So the yogis were interested in these kinds of things. So the very first origins of yoga go back thousands and thousands of years in the Indus Valley, where they started noticing around them that their lives were made better if the crops were better and the rains cooperated and the weather cooperated. And their lives were worse if there was a drought, that kind of thing. And so they started to look for ways to make their lives better. And so the very origins of yoga are, trying to manipulate nature as much as you can. And when you can't manipulate nature, then you manipulate your senses, and you start to look outside of your senses to all that chain of causality that's both within your grasp and outside of your grasp. And so the stuff that's outside of your grasp, you start to attribute to these forces that you're not even aware of and that you can't even conceive of. And that's God, right? For lack of a better word. That's a deity, or in Hindu culture today, modern Hindu culture, going back thousands of years, there are thousands and thousands and thousands of deities that people would pray to. And then they would start to figure out, okay, so what does this deity need to be happy? And you would figure out, well, they need a sacrifice of some sort, or they need to, have water and food prepared in a certain way and presented to the altar and all that kind of stuff. So that's where the origins of yoga are. Okay, so the origins of yoga go back to a time when people didn't have the kind of technical knowledge that we do now, the kind of scientific knowledge and the way to apprehend what's going on in the world. They had no microscopes, they had no telescopes. And yet they still figured things out, right? They still were able to delineate things. And so there are many, many schools of yoga that have emerged over the last several thousand years, and there's just no way to cover it, even in, an entire graduate degree. But, today, what I wanted to kind of get into and just barely scratch the surface of is to start to see how these various schools of yoga are different, and yet there's an underlying principle that underlies all of them. And that's, as Oliver mentioned, to find union. Union with what? Well, union with what is true, union with what is timeless, union with the ultimate reality. Because as we know through quantum physics, through whatever explorations that you've done, like what we see, like this looks solid, but actually it's not. The further in you go, the more space there is. And the more forces are at work here that we just can't even conceive of how things actually work. And so to release our kind of grip on these ideas that we have about how things are and how things work is to do yoga. To recognize that we are limited in some way is to do yoga. To confront and to take a hard look at where you are with a real kind of lens to your current condition is where it starts. It doesn't start with the deity and looking outside of yourself and trying to reach for something that is not within your grasp. It's all here. It's all here at work right now. All the causes and conditions have come together to create this particular moment. And that goes for the next moment and the moment after that, and so on and so forth. And going back into time immemorial, right? So one of the systems that's kind of started things off in terms of enumerating was the Sankhya system. And so the Sankhya system, Sankhya literally means to number something, to enumerate. And so they started to enumerate some principles of reality. And those include all our five senses. And then tied to that are the capacities that we have, the receptive sense capacities that we have. So, right, so for instance, the smell, the attribute perceptible to our senses is the odor, right? For the taste, the attribute is also called taste. For seeing, it's form, see forms, right? For touching, it's tactility, whether it's in our mouth or in our hands or wherever in our bodies. For hearing, it's sound. And so with all of these, the yogis started attributing other active relational capacities to them. And so at the break, you can go up there and you can see on the bottom of this chart here, I'll just point it out. So right now, we're going to ignore all that's up here, and we're just going to talk about this stuff down. Okay. So we have smell, we have odor, taste, we have seeing, we have touching, we have tactility, and this starts to enumerate what's going on in the world, right? And so also we have the elements that make up the material world that are attributed to each one of these. So for smell, it's earth. For tasting, it's water. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because you cannot taste unless you have saliva. For seeing, it's fire. You can't see unless something is illuminated. For touch, it's wind or air, right? So until something has a shape to it, there's no air. And then for hearing, it's space. That's the most subtle of the elements, right? There's space, and that's sound is the first thing to emerge out of space. And so yoga begins with listening. Yoga begins with listening, with an open heart, with an open mind, to try to figure out, like, what am I actually hearing? Okay, and then we talked about these instruments of mind. So there's these three instruments of mind above that, right? So we have, as I mentioned, the buddhi mind, which is about discernment. And then emanating out of that is the I maker, ahamkara, it's called in Sanskrit. So the I maker is our sense of self. And this isn't an ego self, like, we prop ourselves up and ego is bad. It's actually quite sacred, right? The act of creating something around ourselves is creating a sacred container for our own exploration, because this is the thing that we have at all times. And this is the thing that we can look deep within to see the causes and conditions that created who we are. And then can see, coming out of that, manas, mind storage, or emotions, right? All those memories that come up when you conjure anything up. When the sound of my voice may be conjuring something up, this room might be conjuring something up. Like everything dips into this deep store of emotions that we have and these memories that we have. And so, Ahamkara, the sense of I, is always looking outwards to create a sense of self. Like, I come to the center of love on Sundays, I must be a good person, right? I do yoga, I must be a good person. I drive, an electric car, whatever it is, right? I hang out with these people. I vote Democrat, not Republican. That makes me a good person. Whatever it is, right? We look to ourselves. I eat only organic food. All these senses that we are engaged in using at all times reinforce our sense of self, no matter what it is. The music we listen to, the movies we watch, all those things reinforce our sense of self. So manas, the deep store of emotions, is the organizer of sensation, and it's the organizer of that store of memories, and it allows us to give attention to some things and to ignore others. That's why when we saw the different flavors that were available in the chocolate, we used to say, oh, I like mint, I'm going to take the mint one, right? That's your deep store of information that reinforces, yes, indeed, this was a good piece of chocolate. And so might be a little abstract, but this is, if you're following me, it's like, it just makes sense, right? It's not, and this is yoga, right? This is the very foundation of pretty much every school of yoga. It starts with like, what is actually happening here, okay? And so that's, to me, why it's so fascinating. It doesn't require a limber body. It doesn't require special skills or special strengths or special abilities. It only requires the ability to be present to what is actually happening now at all times. So at worst, when these three aspects of mind come together, at best, I guess, it reinforces, yes, I'm doing all these things, I'm living according to my values, I'm living according to learning from my experiences and doing better when I can do better and all those things, right? At worst, it reinforces what is worst about you. South of the border, we've got a perfect example in, Mr. Trump, who instead of becoming porous and open and vulnerable and looking inwards and acknowledging his mistakes and learning, he looks outwards to try and reinforce his positive self-image, as not well earned as that positive self-image is, right? He keeps looking towards people to reinforce that image. And when he's challenged in any way, shape, or form, what does he do? He rebels, right? He seeks redemption, right? Retribution. Like, I'm going to be a dictator on day one and put all those people who badmouthed me and who challenged me in prison, right? So we all do this to certain degrees, right? It's not just the Trumps of the world who do that. And, another perfect example of someone, Trump, who did he pick? J.D. Vance. So J.D. Vance, instead of having that sacred eye maker, that's a sacred part of being a human being, J.D. Vance has changed his name 3 times. He doesn't know who he is, right? So he defines himself according to who he's around. When he was in Appalachia, with one family, he was a certain way and had a certain name. And his grandmother adopted him, and he changed his name and he was another way. And then he went to Yale, and then he started surrounding himself with all these other people who were not at all like him. And then so he started identifying with them. And so J.D. Vance now is clearly someone who has zero values, zero knowledge of who he actually is, and will do whatever it takes to keep belonging to the group that he belongs to. To the point where he will just blindly criticize Kamala Harris for being of dual heritage when his own kids are from a dual heritage. Like, that's how blind it makes you. So that's at its worst, if you're not careful, that's what happens to this eye maker. All right. But at its best, you can see that there's the potential there to say, what are my values and what do I believe in? And, polar opposite of Donald Trump, Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison, right? And never turned a hateful eye towards his captors, whether there's the jail guards or people ask him, do you hate white people? No, I don't hate white people. I hate the system that grew up around this idea, because every system has its own ego identity as well, right? And so he recognized that at his core, he was love. And at the core of everybody else around him, if they're human, that must be love too. And so he sought ways to bring that out in himself and bring that out and recognize it in others, right? So your sense of self can be a sacred vessel from which you can explore. Okay, so the Sankhya system basically stops there and says, all of this stuff that we just talked about, all of our senses, all of our sense capacities, all the matter that we see around us, including our mind, these aspects of mind, this is all called prakriti. This is the world of things. And all of it is changeable. It's volatile, depending on how all these elements come together to create whatever it is. Chocolate, these chairs, me, you, and these things are constantly changing. Like this, the last time that I gave a talk like this was, I think, 7 years ago, and I'm a completely different person today. But there is no cell in my body that is the same as it was 7 years ago. We are all volatile. We're all volatile organic compounds. And so we're all constantly renewing ourselves. And so this world of things, on a grander scale, is also constantly renewing itself. And so the Samkhya system of yoga sees this world as being divided between the world of things and then the seer. So above that is Purusha. So the seer is that part that we call sometimes soul. So that soul that oversees everything. And then there's the world of the seen. Okay, so how are we doing on time here? 11:10. Oh my goodness. Oh, what? Okay. So we are going to move on to the upper part of that chart now, because there's another way of seeing the world that I find is more realistic. Because to me, yeah, that chocolate sometimes is divine, right? So, sometimes music is divine. Sometimes art is divine. Sometimes being in the company of someone else is divine. Sometimes seeing a sunset is divine. It just feels divine. And so, Oliver was asking, whether love is a feeling or if it's an action, right? In the view of another school of yoga called Tantra, the answer is yes. There is a time for love to be static and all encompassing and all knowing without actually having any movement associated with it. And then there's that feeling of love that is dynamic. And so there's this other school of yoga called Tantra that saw that beyond the world of the scene, the stuff of existence, there is not just one individual soul in a sea of souls. That's where Samkhya ends, and that's where Patanjali ends in terms of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You might have heard of that so many yoga teachers trot out, and it's not their fault. They've been led along this long-standing history of the last 100 years that goes back to colonial India and how the Indians got oppressed and beaten down and ridiculed for this other school of yoga, among other things, the school of Tantra, which had a left-hand path and a right-hand path, and the left-hand path got a little too carried away with the joy of it and the sexual aspects. When I say Tantra, you probably think of tantric sex. And that was a part that was run away with and abused in India, and they'll be the first to acknowledge it. And so Tantra had a bad name at the turn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, when yoga started kind of re-emerging, okay? And so in order to kind of allow yoga to to kind of propel itself throughout India and eventually throughout the world, it had to give itself some credibility, and it had to remove itself from the idea of Tantra. But the kind of yoga that we practice, if you've ever gone to yoga class, if you've ever done any kind of hatha yoga, you are doing Tantra. You are not doing the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. As much as that, 20-year-old yoga teacher who just finished her 200-hour certification will tell you that the pose should be steady but stable, yada, 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 they're wrong, okay? So this is why I don't teach anymore. It's because in order for me to teach and to share my version of yoga, it's a commitment. It's a commitment to actually understanding the philosophy behind the true yoga of transformation. And the true yoga of transformation can take many forms. And yes, there's nothing wrong with Patanjali, but that requires what? It requires meditation. At the end of the day, Patanjali's yoga is about meditation, about Raja Yoga. The only reason you do postures and the only reason you do breathing is to settle your body and your mind enough to be able to sit for long periods of meditation. Ultimately, we're talking about Raja Yoga. Okay, that's the only reason that you would want to do that kind of yoga. So is there a reason to have 170 poses No, there's not. If you look at, the actual poses, even in the Hatha yoga tradition, there's only 32 poses in the most elaborate text that's associated with Hatha yoga. And so this is stuff that most people don't know, but most of Hatha yoga relates to Tantra. What is Tantra? Tantra is the expansion of consciousness through the liberation of energy. The expansion of consciousness through the liberation of energy. So, little story. So if you are universal consciousness and you are static consciousness and you're out there and you are everything and you have the potential to be anything, to do anything, but you don't, how much fun is that? Not much fun. So at one point, this universal consciousness decided to create a capacity to create, a creative force, if you will, and call that creative force Shakti. So Shiva is known as that universal, that static consciousness, and the creation of Shakti is his consort, if you will. We're going to the masculine and feminine. So now we have two sides of the same coin, but ultimately there's still one, because there is just one. How much fun is that? Not much, because there's nothing to really refer to. There's nothing actually happening. So there is, in the tantric philosophy, and there's just no time to get into this, but in the tantric philosophy, there's this folk tale of Shiva saying to Shakti, you know what? Let's turn this into a game. Why don't you actually, you have the capacity to create and I don't. So why don't you go out there and create? Create what, she says? Well, create a universe. Go out there and just create for the sake of creating. And what am I going to create these out of? Well, there's only me and there's you. So we're only going to create out of what's in me and you. So go out there and just keep creating and keep individuating. And so that's what Shakti did. And she said, but my love, I can't leave you because, we are ultimately one. And I can, I want to be at your side. He said, no, it's just a game. I'll tell you what, as you're out there creating, just to make it interesting, and so you don't miss me, forget that you were ever with me. Forget that we were ever one. Oh, I can't do that. Oh, no, do it. It'll be fun. But we'll just plant a seed in you that with everything that you create, you'll also plant that seed of remembering that you were once whole and you were once not lacking anything. And you were once in union with the truly divine and the truly universal consciousness. And so Shakti decided, okay, that's what I'll do. And so ever since then, that's what's been happening. And so there's no object in the universe that has not been created through this desire. So this, that fundamental sacred desire to create, to have something going across the mirror of consciousness, right? It's one thing to have that mirror of consciousness that reflects everything, but if there's nothing to reflect, the mirror is useless. So that's what we all are, according to Tantra. That's what everything in the universe is, according to Tantra. And the challenge is to realize that we are all individuated forms, diluted forms, reduced forms of that divine. And we have the same capacities of the divine within us, but they're called slightly different things. Okay, so in the divine realm, we have these three aspects up there. We'll talk about it during the break, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. But those aspects of the will. So when that divine duo has that in mind, so that there's I of Shiva, and then there's this of Shakti, right? So when I predominates, that's will. So that's that the board of directors, if you will, right? That's the guiding ship, the guiding light. I am this. And then we have this I am, when the actual thing that is created is more predominant than the thing that created it. And that's the aspect of knowledge. And then you have the third aspect when both are in a balanced state. And that's the idea of action. That's what's called spanda. So on the other board there on the right, spanda is that vibration, that tension, if you will, that coin toss throughout the universe of Shiva and Shakti making its way. And so that spanda translates everywhere. And it translates as this paradoxical tension between opposites. So the paradoxical tension between opposites lands in us in so many ways, in our heartbeat, in our breath, in our sleeping, in our waking, all these opposites, right? Ignorance, wisdom, all those things, that is all an echo of that original desire to create something for the mirror of consciousness to be able to reflect. So that, in a nutshell, is the tantric view. Now, in order for that to be to trickle its way down to us, we also have been measured. We all have a measured piece of the divine in us. And instead of that will, knowledge, and action, that's measured by Maya. So Maya, in some traditions, is the goddess of illusion, right? She veils us from the absolute and creates this idea that we are separate from the absolute. So that's in some traditions, that's what Maya is. In Tantra, Maya is she who measures. So she measures out those aspects of the divine into our earthly forms. What does she measure? She measures time, space, knowledge, energy, and desire. Time, space, knowledge, energy, and desire. What are those things? Those are all things that we are bound by. These are all things that we have a limited capacity for, a limited capacity of. And so that means that each one of us is measured out in this varying levels of time, space, knowledge, energy, and desire. We all live different lifespans. We all take up different space. We all have different levels of knowledge. We all have different energy levels. We're all able to act in different ways, depending on physical conditions or where we were born, how we were born, what privileges we have, all those things. So the thing about yoga practice is recognizing first, how have I been measured out? What do I look like? Right? According to these. And that trickles down to also, our mind as an instrument. And then those sense capacities, all these capacities that I have, what am I starting with? And then what are my aptitudes? What path do I need to take to expand this? Because again, Tantra, enlightenment, is expansion of consciousness through the liberation of energy. Because at the end of the day, even though we've been measured out with these gross material forms and these limited capacities, it's said that at the base of our spine is the life force power of the universe, every single one of us. And we are able to liberate that through a path of yoga. So each one of those, time, space, knowledge, energy, and desire, is a path of yoga. Time is Raja Yoga. So time is Hatha Yoga. Time, we have a limited time on earth. through Hatha Yoga, by doing postures, by doing all these other kriyas, by doing all these purification things, we can actually extend the amount of time that we have on earth to be able to meditate more, right? At a gross level. Okay. So action. So we all have, let's talk about energy, right? We all have a limited capacity for energy. And so that's the path of karma yoga, because if you're only devoting your energy to making yourself a better person and to making yourself more comfortable, you're just going to stay stuck within that limited energy. But if you start turning your attention towards other people around you and other people in need, then you will connect to the divine, because the divine ultimately wants everybody to be free. And so forces will come together to help you to increase your energy, your total store of energy, to be able to help everyone around you, right? Space is Raja Yoga, right? So we're that action reaction, right? So as soon as something happens, we have this split second where we react. Through Raja Yoga, through meditation, we create space between the stimulus and the response, right? So that's that space. So all of these are desire, bhakti yoga, right? So we have a limited amount of desire. If you find yourself, for instance, being like pursuing alcohol or drugs or sex or rock and roll, whatever it is, something that you're really like you're fixated on, you become an addict, that's pointing something out to you. It's pointing something out to you that, hey, you need to examine your desire. And maybe your desire needs to be channeled to something else. If you have extraordinary amount of desire, maybe if you channel that desire towards something more constructive rather than sex, drugs, rock and roll, whatever it is, maybe that would be better for you and it would expand your consciousness. Okay. So I know this is probably like drinking from a fire hose, but this is just to point out, and I can send a follow-up email to send you towards some resources if you want to check this stuff out a little bit further. But my main mission in terms of my yoga practice is to let people know that there's a path for everybody, and it's not just doing postures. And if you are doing the postures, there's a certain way of doing the postures and doing your practice, your physical practice, that will respect the actual origins of Hatha Yoga, which is related to Tantra. We can do that after the break a little bit, perhaps as we settle into our meditation, just to give you a taste of like what that looks like in terms of everyday practice. So I know that was a lot of information, and it can feel a bit overwhelming. So I'll see if I can try to kind of break things down to a little bit more manageable size, just leading up to our meditation here, just for a couple of minutes. So Tantra, it's worth pointing out, tan from the root tan, it literally means a loom. So weaver's loom. And it's also can be seen as a web or a matrix. Okay, so if you've spent any time looking at that chart up there, there's levels, right? And so there's these different levels of awareness, different levels, starting from Shiva and Shakti, and then they separate in those three aspects of their divine powers. And then they, are measured out by Maya. Maya measures out time, space, knowledge, energy, and desire. So you start to see that there's this loom that appears, right? Horizontally and vertically. And so for me, like, sure, when you initially look at that, and I encourage you to take a picture of it, you probably won't find as thorough a treatment of it anywhere. I didn't find one online or anywhere else or in any books. It's kind of very rare to have things distilled into that, because that is literally the theory of everything. There's nothing, and I've tested this for over 10 years now, and there's nothing that has ever happened to me in my life that I can't relate to that somehow and find some kind of rationale in that. So to me, it's a tool, and that's what yoga is meant to be. It's meant to be a tool. It's meant to be a vehicle, and ultimately, you're meant to get rid of the vehicle at the end of the road, right? So these are all And this, as I mentioned before the break, this points to at least 5 different ways of practicing yoga, whether it's Raja Yoga, Jnana Yoga, by the way, it's pronounced Jnana. Jnana Yoga, the yoga of the mind. So expanding your knowledge, just expanding your knowledge the way that you do when you come to talks like this is a form of yoga. Hopefully you come out of here with, a fraction of something that resonates with you. If you ever go to Dharma talks given by monks, they'll usually end the talk by saying, if something resonated with you, great, take it, it's yours. If it didn't, then throw it all away, it doesn't matter. I'll say the same thing for my talk. If some of this resonated, great, I'm happy. If it didn't, I'm also happy. It really makes no difference. Because we're all part of this matrix, we're part of the loom. We're all threads upon this loom. And whether we realize it or not, we're all painting the same picture. We're all crafting the same tapestry back to that original consciousness, okay? In the meantime, there are ways to kind of get our way there a little bit more quickly, and that's what yoga practice is in terms of hatha yoga. So hatha, ha, there's 2 syllables there. Ha literally means sun, ta, moon. So, and you can hear it because in most Sanskrit words, the actual meaning of the word comes to you from the sound of the word. So, hot, right? Something falling, right? So there's that outward expansive quality of the sun, and then there's that more kind of descending, compressing, squeezing energy of the moon. So when you're doing something like yin yoga, you're expressing one of those moon energies. We need both because we can't always be inhaling. We need to exhale. We can't always be awake. We can't always be active. We need to sleep. So it's just the natural order of things. The tides go in, tides go out, all these things. So in terms of our yoga practice, as I was saying, there's this life force power of the universe is said to be locked up at the base of our spines, known as Kundalini. So Kundalini is like a coiled up snake that is waiting to wake up and wake us up and work through what's known as the Sushumna Nadi. So Nadi are energy flows in the body. And you don't have to be a yogi to realize that sometimes you feel good, sometimes you feel bad, sometimes you feel energetic, sometimes you feel sleepy. All these things are energy flows. So the yogis, again, have examined these things to death, and we're said to have 72,000 nadis. And so 3 of these 72,000, 3 really matter. There's the Ida Nadi, Pingala Nadi, and the Sushumna Nadi. Ida Nadi is the left side, the moon side. The Pingala Nadi is the right side, the solar side. So when we're kind of trying to activate ourselves, we can use these practices, right? We can, the right nostril, for instance, is an access point for that right side of the body, that Pingala Nadi. The left nostril is an access point for the left side. And so when you read things like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the main text on the Hatha Yoga practice, it will tell you that you can do all these practices all you want, but don't do them in the daytime or in the nighttime. Otherwise, all of this stuff is like the ramblings of a fool. And they're not saying that you're not supposed to practice either at day or night. They're saying don't practice while you're dominant on one side or the other. You want to bring things into balance. And when you bring things into balance, you open up that central channel, which is where the chakras reside. Okay, the chakras reside, and they correlate exactly to those elements we talked about earlier. So earth element is smell, water element is taste, fire element, seeing, air element, touching, space, hearing. Those are the first 5 chakras. And then there's Ajna chakra, which is the elements of mind. And then there's the Sahasrara chakra, which gives us access to the divine. Okay, so it's kind of an active, referencing back to what Walt was talking about at the beginning of this. So, is love, the knowledge thing, that's all about knowledge, or is it all about action? And the answer is it's about both. Okay, so first of all, you need to know about the potential for this. You have to know, and you have to trust, to have absolute faith and courage and patience that there is a divine force out there that is trying to meet you halfway. And so when you're trying to be met halfway, you need to do your part. And so our part is through our yoga practice, and in Hatha yoga, it is balancing things out. That includes not getting too overreactive in terms of, pleasure, pain, not too happy, not too sad, all those things, right? We want to find balance. And when we find balance, we open up access to that central channel. Okay, so before we go into meditation, whether you're talking about Hatha yoga, or whether you're talking about the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or even Buddhist meditation, Jainism, all these things that usually begins with finding some centering. And so before we get into our meditation, we're going to do a little bit of centering using the breath. I'll just mention that you can also do these things in terms of posture, right? So, oftentimes if you go to a yoga class, they'll be doing some back bending poses and some heart opening poses in order to stimulate you. Well, yeah, that's what's going to happen when you do those kinds of things, right? You're just physiologically, you're going to compress your adrenals, you're going to compress your kidneys, and you're going to create heat in the body. And so you're going to activate that right side, the solar side. When you go to yin yoga, you're going to do a lot of poses that are on the ground. Grounding, you're very slow and steady, and you're going to activate the left side. So all those things, the prana, which is the expression of that spanda, that Shiva Shakti in our individual bodies, that's what we are going to try to activate into the central channel of the body.